Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the shapes classes. So a shape is a class that's an abstract base class that defines common properties for all shapes. Now, even though it's called shape, sometimes some of the things that are included with this don't really make sense because, for example, a line is considered to be a shape. An ellipse is considered to be a shape. So it can sometimes, and even text is considered to be a shape. So it can sometimes mess with you to think about which classes are shaped subclasses and which classes aren't. Today, and in the ensuing lessons, we're going to be talking about how to better use these classes and how to leverage them with our knowledge of the shape class. Now, some of these methods that are obviously going to be common to all shapes are the fill, stroke, and stroke width methods. These have corresponding properties, and all of these have a purpose. For example, the fill property specifies the color that fills the interior of a shape. We've used this when we were talking about circles for the first time. The stroke property specifies the color that is used to draw the outline of a shape. And the stroke width property defines the width of the outline of the shape. In today's lesson and ensuing lessons, we're going to be talking about the text, line, rectangle, circle, ellipse, polygon, and polyline classes. If you don't know what any of these are, don't worry, we'll be expanding upon what they are. They're all used to draw text and to draw simple shapes. All of these are subclasses of the shape class. The way this works is that the shape class itself is a subclass of the node class. So text, line, rectangle, circle, ellipse, arc, polyline, and polygon are all subclasses of the node class as well. So everything we've talked about with regards to nodes still applies. Today we're going to be talking about the text class, which defines a node that displays a string at a starting point, xy, and the text object is usually going to be placed in a pane. The pane's upper left corner is going to be 0, 0, and the pane's bottom right corner is going to be pane.getWidth, pane.getHeight. Remember, it's red x, y. A string might be displayed in multiple lines using the /n escape character, and the UML diagram for the text class is actually fairly simple. It has a couple of properties. The text property, which is a string property, and remember all of these are going to be bindable. They're all string properties, not just strings. The text property defines the text to be displayed. The x property defines the x coordinate. Y defines the y coordinate. Underline defines whether or not the line has an underline underneath it, which is by default false. The strike through Boolean property defines whether or not a line has a strike through it, which is by default false. And the font property defines the font for the text. And you can easily see how we can actually set the font using the font methods and the font class we've talked about in previous lessons. There are three main constructors we should know about. The text, which just creates an empty text. The text with the specified string, which creates a string with the specified text. And the text with the specified xy and string, which creates a text object at the specified xy coordinate. If you do just use the argumented constructor with only one argument, the text string, that'll display a string at the 0, 0 xy coordinate. So our goal today is we're going to have to create a window that displays programming is fun in bold, and then we're going to have to display programming is fun display text on the next line, not in bold. Then we're going to have to display programming is fun display text on another line, this time with it being struck through. So we're going to have three text objects that are going to be displayed today. So we're actually going to create a new class file, since this is a distinct idea from the previous layout panes that we've been talking about. The shapes are going to be in their own class file. So we're going to call this class file show shapes. And this will have a main method, just like the other classes we've talked about. This is going to be a public static void main. It's going to be taking the string arguments. Hopefully you don't forget how to do this. We're going to have it just in case for compatibility. And we're going to say application.launch with the specified arguments. And automatically we'll have the application class be imported. After that, we now have to get started with the appropriate import statements. Once we've imported the application class, we need to import the scene class, which is stored under JavaFX.scene.scene. Then we have to import the JavaFX.scene.layout text.pane. Today we're only going to be using the pane. In later lessons we will be using the more complex panes that we've talked about. And in later lessons we're obviously going to be adding in more import statements for the appropriate classes. Then we're going to need to import the JavaFX scene.paint.color, and you'll see why. We're going to need to import the JavaFX.geometry.insets for having appropriate padding. And then we're going to need to import the stage class, which is stored under JavaFX.stage.stage. Then we need to import the text class, and inside that text class we need the text class, the font class, the font weight class, and the font posture class. So we're going to import the JavaFX.scene.text.text, and from here we'll just copy and paste down because we're going to have mostly the same thing from here. Instead of just having text, we're going to import font as well. Then we need font weight, and then we need font posture. And then finally we need to make sure we extend the application class so that we can override its start method, as long as we have our override annotation. And then we can now create that start method with the primary stage. And with that, we're now done with the setup, and we can now get started with what we're going to be doing here. The first thing we're going to need to do is create a pane. We only need a basic pane here, since we don't need to specify that we only need to take up part of the pane or anything. Today we're fine with taking up the entire screen with our text. So we're going to create a new pane. We'll call it pane. That's equal to a new pane and no arguments. We don't need any specific arguments on this. However, we need to make sure we have the appropriate padding. And this padding is going to be of new insets. And we're going to have a padding of 5 on all sides. Now remember, you can either say 5, 5, 5, 5, or you can just say 5, which automatically assumes you want a padding of 5 on all sides. Then we can create our first text object. Now hopefully you recall we have three different types of constructors here. You have the no arg constructor, the constructor with just the string, and then you have the constructor with the string and the xy coordinates. We're going to use the xy coordinates one here, since we want this to be, we know where we want to place it. So we're going to say the text1 is equal to a new text, and then we provide our xy coordinates. We're going to say 20, 20, our string, which in this case is going to say programming is fun. So what this just says is we want the text object to be displayed at the pixels 20, 20, and that's where it starts. It'll read automatically across from there on out. However, as I mentioned, we want this first almost title to be bolded and italicized. We can also set its font. So let's say we want to do this. We're going to say text1.setFont. And because it's a subclass of the nodes, and because we can therefore set any sort of font on it, we're going to say we want a courier font here. So the way to do that would be to say font.font, and then we provide our arguments. In this case, we have to make sure we say our font family, which is going to be courier, and then we have to make sure we have our boldness, which in this case we want to be bold. Then we have to make sure we have our italicization, which we want to be italicized in this case. And you'll notice you can autofill that. And then finally we have to provide our size. Our size in this case is going to be 15. You can set the size of your font to be whatever you want. Finally, we have to make sure we add this to the pane. So we know how to do this. We just say pane.getChildren.add, and then we add in text1. And with that, we're now done with adding the first text. After that, though, we now have to add that second text. As I mentioned, this second text is just going to say programming is fun, then an enter, or a return, then it's going to say display text. We're not going to underline, we don't want to bold, we don't want to italicize, so we can just create a text object with the default text. If you're wondering what the default text is for a Java program, the default text is the plain text. You might see this if you create a notepad document. It's going to be that same text type, or the same font type. So after that, we can now create that second text object. And because we're not doing anything fancy with it, we can just create a text object and then immediately add that text object back into the pane. Now you could make this an anonymous text object. There's no reason not to, but in our case we want to have as much experience with creating a text object and using those constructors as possible, so we're going to explicitly declare this. So we're going to say the text2 is equal to a new text, and this time we're going to keep it at 60, 60. So it'll be about 3 times lower than the original font was. Where the original text would be at the top, this one will be somewhere in the middle of our program. In addition, it's going to be somewhere near the center of our program as well, since by default the pane will only be as big as necessary. After that, we can now create our statement. We want to say programming is fun, and then we need to have a return. Hopefully you recall the way we enter a return is by saying \n. This is the escape sequence for saying new line. Then we're going to say display text. And then we're not going to modify this in any way. After that, we can now add this text into the pane using the same method we did up here, which is to say pane.getChildren, and then we just provide the .add, and then we want to add the text1, or in this case text2. After that, we can now get started with the third text object. Now this third text object gives us a little bit of flexibility, because as I mentioned, we want it to be similar, or near the same column as the original programming is fun, but we want it to be underlined, and we want it to be struck through. Now we have a choice here. We can either create a font object and then modify the font object, or we can use some of those methods I mentioned, such as the set underline and set strike through, to modify it directly. Instead of having to create a new font object and then using the font object modify the text object, we can just modify the text object directly. So first we have to create our text object though. We're going to say this is text3, which is equal to a new text with the parameters of 10, 100, which means it'll be similar to the same column as the original programming is fun, but it won't be at the same column identically. That's just so that we can show that we have as much flexibility as we want in terms of pixels. It'll be at 100, so it'll be far, far, far further down than the other ones. And the space between the first line, between this first grouping of programming is fun and the second grouping, should be the same as the grouping between the second grouping and the third grouping, assuming that our program has the appropriate amount of horizontal space. And then we have to display our message, which in this case is going to be the same message as we displayed up here. So we're just going to copy paste this. The only difference is in that case we weren't modifying it. In this case we need to modify it. We want to set a color, we want to set an underline, and we need to set a strike through. The reason we can set all of these things is because, once again, they're subclasses of the shape class, and therefore subclasses of the node class, so we have all of these common methods, such as set fill, set underline, and set strike through. So we're going to say text3.setFill. This is so that we can set the font color. Now you might be looking at this and saying, well, how do you set the fill of a line or of a string? Now, while it doesn't make perfect sense, think about it as though you were filling in the letters with a certain color. So if we were to say color red, what it's really doing is it has the text string and it's just coloring in each of those letters red. So even though it doesn't make strict sense, the setFill method with a text object is just saying set the font color. After that, we need to make sure we set the underline. Hopefully you recall that the method for that was text3.setUnderline, and then we provide a boolean value, which is going to be true, which makes it underlined, and then we have to make sure we strike through. So we're going to say text3.set strike through, and that's going to be true again. Now what this will do is by setting it to be struck through, it'll automatically make it a little bit fainter. It'll reduce the color, it'll make it gray. This means that it'll be a little bit nicer to read, so that's why we kind of say strike through. By striking through, it'll automatically make it a little bit lighter, because in general, if you want to strike something through, you want it to be a little bit more transparent. After that, we can now add this to the pane, and then we can now, once we've added it, we can then just create the scene, set the title, set the scene, and show it back to the user. So we're going to add in the text3 object, and now we can get started with the creation of the scenes, which is fairly standard. Hopefully you recall what we're doing here. We're going to set the scene with the new pane object. Then we're going to have the primary stage dot set title, which will set the title for the window, and that's going to say, for example, show text. You can make it whatever title you want. And then we're going to say primary stage dot set scene, and then we'll set the scene with the appropriate scene that we've created right here. And finally, we'll display it out using the primary stage dot show method. And with that, we can now try out our program. So to summarize what we've done here, we've created a text object, set its font, placed it into the pane right here. Then we created a second text object and placed that directly into the pane, no modifications. And then, finally, we set a text object, set the color to red, set the underline to true, made it struck through, and then added it to the pane. So let's try this out. Let's run our program. You can see now that we have 3 new text objects. The first text object is bolded, and it says programming is fun, nothing else. Then we have the programming is fun display text with no modifications, but the display text is on the next line because we specified that. And then it says programming is fun display text in red, struck through, and underlined. Now you might notice that the spacing between the programming is fun and the second programming is fun is not the same as the distance between the display text and the programming is fun, even though in theory the pixels were the same. There were 40 pixels separating them in each case. This is because the display text is on the next line. If we make the program a little bit bigger, if we changed it to a, for example, border pane object that automatically reshaped its objects depending on the size of the window, then the spacing would become equal. The spacing is not equal only because there is an extra line of text here compared to there is no extra line of text here. Hopefully you found this lesson useful, and hopefully, based on what we've talked about today, you're able to implement the text objects in your own programs.